The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today, and welcome to this session on climate risk in association with legal brokers. So my name is Irina, and I'm part of an account management team at Groundshaw, and will be your speaker for today. So on this topic of climate change, we actually have worked with Stephen Sykes, who is an environmental lawyer from Capital Law, on this material, just to ensure that we are being as practical as we possibly can for obviously this task at hand. So in today's session, we will cover how climate change affects UK real estate, and we will look at new Law Society guidance. And we will also look at Groundshaw Climate Index, which we actually include in our reports, which of course will help you notify your clients of any potential climate risk. So if we move across to the next slide. So let's look at it slightly from a scientific view. So of course we are aware that climate change is already impacting on property both globally and in the UK, and something that we see regularly actually on the news, and sadly it will be appearing more as time goes on. So on the screen we have actually a few various maps and graphs from NASA and the World Bank. So the first graph, which actually at the top left-hand corner, so we can see a graph from NASA displaying the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels for the last 800 years, and you'll see that 1950 level, obviously, and the current levels. So in the last 800 years, there have been 8 cycles of ice ages and warmer periods as well, with the end of the last ice age about just under 12,000 years ago, making obviously the beginning of the modern climate era and of human civilization. So most of these climate changes, according to NASA, are attributed to very small variations in Earth orbit that change the amount of solar energy our planet receives. So while Earth's climate has changed through its history, the current warming is happening at the rate not seen in the last 10,000 years. So scientific information taken from natural sources such as ice cores, rocks, and tree ratings, and from modern equipment like satellites and weather instruments are all show the signs of climate change. Now, if we look actually at the next graph, so we can see the global average temperatures dating back to 1880, and that's where obviously we currently are around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial times. Now, on the top right-hand corner, we can see the observed global average temperatures change, and then the future temperature projections across 3 different emission scenarios. So we have representative concentration pathway, or RCP, basically. So the first one is 2.6, which is the lower, or shall we say the best case scenario. Then the RCP, which is 4.5, which is the middle scenario. And then there is RCP 0.8.5, which is the worst case scenario. And which scenario, or shall I say, which representative concentration path we will fall into, will largely depend on the future global greenhouse gas emissions, which we can see in the bottom right graph has obviously continued to rise. So the bottom left maps just illustrate the change in surface temperatures. And as you can see, a map of the world under the RCP 8.5 concentration. So as you can see, it obviously gets very warm. Now, last summer, we at Groundshaw, we actually held a conference on climate change in London. And we had a few people come in to present obviously on the topic, and one of them was from Met Office, who presented this weather forecast for 22nd of July 2050, which recorded a daytime high of 43 degrees and a nighttime minimum of 24 degrees. Now, it turned out that a month after the conference, the UK actually hit a record high of 40.3 degrees, if you remember, over 2 consecutive days, with a nighttime low of 26 degrees, which is literally almost exactly the same forecast, just a whole generation earlier. And that actually was the driest July since 1935. So actually, they also went to say that rainfall deficit will also lead to more prolonged drought periods, especially so in the east and southeast of England. And obviously, there is clay-based soils, which can lead to a greater shrink swell subsidence. Now, think of the foreseeable consequences of these predictable impacts on property. So you can have stranded assets, uninsurable properties, you can have loss of properties, you can have collapse of value, then there is liability, and then there is also could be PI claims as well. Now, if we look at the risk in terms of numbers of properties in the UK, so today there are around 8,000 properties at the risk of coastal erosion and 5.5 million at the risk of flooding. Then in 5 years, those figures look like an additional 10,000 and 2.2 million respectively. Now, by 2050, which is actually not that far away, it's only in 27 years from now, those figures increase again to over 40,000 and 2.5 million over and above what the risk is today. And this isn't just about the loss of property. The climate change has obviously a severe consequences for our way of life and our economic success or failure and our future, of course. So two big ones for, I guess, for the banks. So for example, Barclays are subsidence and flooding. And modeling used is UKCP 18 for the Bank of England modules, their climate data. Now, impacts over the next 20 to 30 years are increasing. So to give you probably more context, contaminated land has about 350,000 sites potentially at risk. Now, climate change, we are talking obviously about millions of properties potentially at risk. Of course, it's a big topic and it is objective, and but it is used by scientists, and the data is available from organizations like Met Office, VGS, and other environmental organizations who, again, use and module this data. So if we put the risk slightly in a different way, so we will obviously experience rising sea levels, which will result in more coastal erosion, flooded homes and businesses, increased insurance premiums, loss of property, and impacts on mortgageability in some locations. You will also experience hotter summers, so more subsidence from shrink swell soils in particular. Again, there could be more hosepipe bans, wildfires, and drought like we did last summer. We will also experience wetter winters, which lead to more flooding. And the UK is already prone to flooding, but obviously this is just extra stress on already stressed land and infrastructure. And yet still some people build on floodplains. So there was actually an article that said that there was about £525 billion worth of property that could be written off due to the climate change in long term. And that's a substantial figure. So whilst reducing the impacts of climate change is unlikely, based on our obviously current trajectory, you can help your clients make a better informed decision on their purchase now. So here are just some examples we've seen recently. And because climate change obviously is a global issue, there is a strong link between what we see abroad to what we see at home. So in the 2023 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, it actually ranked natural disasters and extreme weather events as the second most severe global risk over the next 2 years, and ranked climate change as the most severe global risk over the next 10 years. In fact, there are 4 topics relating to climate change were ranked as the top 4 most severe risks over the next 10 years. And these 4 are failure to mitigate change, failure to climate change adaptation, natural disasters and extreme weather events, and biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So what has been actually driving the climate change in our industry the past few years? Well, one of the biggest drivers actually is the lender and the insurers. So in 2019, the Bank of England released a supervisory statement, which was the jumping off point for climate risk modeling and assessing risk and how it relates to lending risk across their portfolio. So in 2020, the Chancery Lane project released a report statement flagging up climate change as a risk, advising firms to work towards a more climate considerate approach. Now, they also developed then minor clauses and a report on title. So this climate change clauses was designed for lawyers and conveyancers to use when climate change risk searches were unavailable. Of course, now we have got searches available for that. So anyway, these clauses were one of the earlier signs to the profession and for solicitors to realize that they may have to have a responsibility to make buyers aware of the future risk that may affect the property being purchased. So the purpose of the clauses was to improve transparency and reporting about the physical, transitional, and future liability risk of climate change for properties in the UK. So the same year, the Law Society set up a climate change working group. And then in October 2021, the Law Society published its resolution. And there were also a few papers and articles written by Sarah DeGay, Julie Wan, Stephen Trauman. So in summary, if we look at Stephen Trauman's, he basically concluded that solicitors and licensed conveyancers owe a duty to clients to provide warning and advice as to the risks which they are or should be aware of and which may adversely affect the property being purchased, including climate change. So this is the part of the general duty to exercise reasonable care and skill in carrying out the retainer. And failure by the solicitors or conveyancers to follow these practices may result in damage claims for professional negligence and increased insurance premiums and possible reputational damage. And about a month ago, the Law Society of England and Wales became the first professional legal organization to issue climate guidance to its 160,000 members. So the guidance encompasses how law firms in general should approach climate change. So how they should become more climate conscious as businesses in their own right, and how they can advise clients about climate risk, so as to avoid claims at a time of heightened environmental, social, and governance risk awareness. So the guidance is the result of about 12 months of detailed work by the Law Society Climate Change Working Group with the help from various consultees, including the UK Environmental Law Association as well. So what we'll do, we now have a look at the Law Society guidance and the impact of climate change on the solicitors. So the guidance for the developing of climate conscious law firm is essential reading for managing partners, compliant officers, and in particular real estate lawyers, because as you can see from the slide, part A of the conveyance of the guidance concerns climate governance issues, so how law firms operate in relation to climate change and how they can cut their carbon emissions. And then part B of the guidance concerns the climate legal duties which solicitors owe to their clients to advise, warn, and disclose climate risks. Now, this is especially relevant to the real estate lawyers working on residential commercial property or corporate support transactions where the value of assets may be impacted by the climate change. So the guidance is intended in part to alert solicitors to the risk of professional negligence if they fail to understand and discharge their legal duties. Now, finally, Part C of the guidance provides an explanation of the categorization of the climate risk examples of climate-related legal risk for specific practical areas, such as real estate, and a checklist for legal practice, including suggested questions for specialist solicitors working in commercial real estate and dispute resolution. So if you have not read the guidance already, it's a 29-page long document, and we actually have produced a summary document, which is available through the QR code on the screen. So the guidance encourages solicitors to upskill to understand and apply the guidance. So it also encourages the use of the tools available to the profession and referencing climate searches. So whilst part B and C are the sole focus here, part A obviously underpins how the law firm should operate. So it essentially sets out the corporate policy of a firm. It ties in ESG, so environmental, social, and the governance, senior partners, corps on devising an ethical client care policy that is then deployed across all departments, and should start with conveyancing and real estate, given they already elevated PI risk in these areas. So as the guidance has received SRA sign-off, the compliance partners such as Legal Eye are of the opinion that climate change will feature on the risk register as a PI and compliance threat, as to do nothing would open up possibly future litigations and a failure to perform duties. So in section 3 of part B of the guidance, there are 4 key solicitor duties that are intended and are applicable when advising clients on the potential impacts of climate change. So they are duty of care, duty to warn, duty to disclose, and duty to uphold services and competence levels. So duty of care, which will fall into the climate change, will impact different areas of the law, businesses, and wider society to varying degrees, directly or indirectly. Consequently, solicitors may have to look beyond the narrow scope of instruction by a client to consider whether and to what extent climate legal risks are relevant. So the relevance of climate legal risk will need to be considered across the firm as a whole and in respect of all transaction work. Now, if we look at duty to warn, so a solicitor should familiarize themselves with what constitutes a physical, transitional, and liability climate change risk. Such definitions are available in Part C of the guidance, as well as publicly available as well online. So you're welcome to look into it on the websites. As such, this should be obvious, obviously, to the solicitor, and they must warn their clients of the potential climate change risk to the transaction. So the guidance actually states that the character and the experience of the client are among the relevant circumstances to be considered in determining the extent of a solicitor's duty to offer advice or information or warnings that are reasonably incidental to the work being carried out. So the law firms has to meet a higher standard of care if it has made a net zero commitments, for example, in its environmental policy as detailed on its website, and has in-house experts on environmental law or climate law or environmental, social, and governance. So the law relating to climate duties is considered in detailed in Professor Sarah Digay's UCL research paper on climate change. So the application of the duties are a fact specific. However, the more the lawyer knows about climate change risk and the less informed the client is about them, the more likely it is that the lawyer will have to warn their clients. Now, if we look at the duty to disclose, so with the release of the Law Society guidance, solicitors will be deemed to have knowledge of the climate change risk, including the search tools available to them, such as obviously Climate Index. So when acting on a matter, you have a duty to disclose to your client all information relating to that matter of which you have the knowledge. So disclose the risk in a clear, understandable way, which of course, that's where we can help you with. So if you're already using ground truth searches, such as home buyers, Avesta, screening, and the review, then you will have actual knowledge on climate change risk, as they automatically include the climate index analysis in the guidance. As such, this information obviously should now be disclosed to the client. And we have also developed climate change reporting clauses, which can be included in the report and certificates on title for both residential and commercial properties. Now, by using the reports that include climate index, such as home buyers and a vista for residential, screening and the review for commercial, and then signposting clients to the potential risk, it enables solicitors to discharge their duty. Further practical steps on how to discharge the duty are also available in Stephen Troman's KC opinion. So these first three duties depend on the nature and sophistication of the client, and it will be higher for residential clients and of course lower for experienced commercial clients. Now, the fourth key duty is around the duty to uphold services and competence levels. So compliance officers for legal practice and practice support lawyers will no doubt wish to review and strengthen the process around how real estate lawyers are trained to understand climate risk and how to evidence that training and how to use practical tools such as climate index to support property transactions. So there is an increased likelihood of climate risk advice being added to law firms' risk registers and compliance review. Now, Groundshaw also provides ongoing training via webinars and CPDs and other resources such as the use of climate risk reporting clauses so that solicitors can be clear about the extent of practical applications of their duties and how to discharge them. Now, the guidance also speaks to actions to take where there are gaps in a lawyer's competence. So the guidance actually states that many solicitors do not currently have experience or training in matters relating to climate legal risk. However, as solicitors understand training as part of their professional development, widespread awareness and acknowledgement will grow over time. So this may intensify the expectations that a reasonably competent solicitor should be aware of and the impact and the relevance of climate change to their practice area and be able to advise clients accordingly. Now, since the publication of Stephen Troman's KC legal opinion, many law firms have participated in training on climate change to better understand the climate search tools available. So if a firm has received any such training, whether this is online or in person, they can be expected to advise their clients on climate-related risk as a matter of course. So the steps required to meet the above duties will to some extent depend on the nature and sophistication of the client. So the standard of care will be higher for residential clients and lower experienced commercial clients. Now, moving on to the section 4 of the guidance. So this deals with how the impact of climate change relates in practice to client relationship. As the impacts of climate change reach further into more areas of social society and the law, solicitors may be expected to guide and support clients as they navigate these challenges. So if we look at 4.2, how to approach a new instruction. So when presented with a new instruction, solicitors should consider a few relevant factors when advising it. So one would be the nature of the client's operations and interests. 2 being the specifics of the matters. 3, the legal service offered. And 4, the impact of climate issues to the clients, the transaction, and public. So considering climate legal risk will almost always be the case with real estate and corporate transactions. So good practice may involve simply ensuring the client understands how such issues may be relevant by signposting the risk that could affect the transaction, and the level of advice given will depend on the sophistication of the client. Predominantly, physical and transitional risk will be relevant in every real estate transaction. As a note, previously, the steps required to meet the duties will depend on the nature and sophistication, of course, of the client. Additionally, law firms will also have to practice a higher standard of care to your clients if the firm has ESG credentials, publish or publicly discuss sustainability, and have a net zero targets or membership to any net zero association. This also reflects to the paper, obviously, by Professor Sarah Duguay. Now, if we look at the next one, which is 4.4, the scope of retainer, well, solicitors can exclude matters from the retainer, but this is not an attractive course of action for climate risk advice. The client's fully informed consent would be required for any change to the retainer. So this in itself is not straightforward, and the solicitors would be required to explain the significance of the relevant issues to the client and the risk that you will not be advising upon. So any changes to the retainer would be additional unchangeable time for the solicitors and could cause possibly reputational damage and again impact upon the PI renewals. So exclude climate change from the retainer will not be looked on kindly by SRA and may be itself a regulatory breach. Now, considering conveyancers in real estate the costliest area of law to insure for professional indemnity risk, scoping out such services would have a negative up on the firm. So put simply, how can a law firm be climate conscious if it does not advise on climate risk? Now, if we look at the next one, which is 4.5, impact of professional indemnity insurance. So solicitors should be mindful of current and prospective requirements of professional indemnity insurers so that they can obtain affordable cover for the areas of practice upon which they wish to advise on. So the most obvious way to demonstrate solicitors are able to advise on climate legal risk would be to undergo training on what is required in the sectors and to purchase a search tool such as Climate Index, which is available to them right now. Now, your next one would be the 4.7, if we look at that one, educational materials and resources. So the SRA currently published its progress report and action plan to address the issues of ongoing competence in law firms. And as such, there will be a greater emphasis on those that are not meeting the SRA standards. So the guidance notes that not all solicitors have expertise or the training in matters relating to climate legal risk, and the need for solicitors to source appropriate education and training resources in order to be able to provide competent advice on these risks. So even by attending, obviously, this session, this is exactly what you're doing. However, should you or anyone in your firm require further training, then again, we are able to offer this to you. So part C of the guidance contains handy checklists to help solicitors understand how climate risk relate to a specific practice area. So it starts splitting climate change risk into three categories. So it looks at physical risk, transitional risk, and liability risk. So it also states that solicitors should advise on physical climate risk and how they impact real estate ownership and the use. So explaining that climate impacts could be impacted in accessibility and insurability and availability of capital investment, right? So for physical risk, it is recommended that solicitors consider the impact of physical events on clients' businesses. So when advising on acquisition and asset purchase, for example, how will climate events affect the business's supply chain and outputs? Will this affect the financial of transaction? How will the client mitigate their GHG emissions and adopt to be climate resilient? So when advising on acquisition or asset purchase, a solicitor should consider how it will affect the client's emission reduction targets and also what adaptation of the asset may be needed to mitigate emissions associated with the asset and improve climate resilience. So associated risk and cost should be flagged as well. So consideration should be given to the impact on asset value and potential commercial impacts. And finally, solicitors should consider the impact of physical events on conveyancing transaction. Is a climate search needed, for example? Solicitors should also address the impacts of the climate events on the property within your advice. So for instance, if the property is on the floodplain, then address increase in flood risk obviously, because that can happen, and the associated cost with it, and availability of insurance, and how this affects the decision to buy this property, and the price as well. So when looking at transitional risk, solicitors should factor emerging climate regulations. So for example, on climate reporting, so into an advice so that the clients are aware of upcoming requirements. So that could be the minimum energy efficiency standards for commercial properties or domestically private properties. Now, be aware of how changes in clients or their customers' demand or stakeholders' sentiment could affect assets value and operational cost. So, for example, the sale value of a company with high carbon footprint could change rapidly as the market tolerance for fossil fuel shifts. So, in conveyancing, changes in a homeowner's view on issues such as properties on floodplains could impact property values, right? So, finally, the solicitor should also take account of the risk that certain properties become uninsurable, or ones of which mortgage finance cannot be obtained. So that's again another thing to consider. So part C goes on to explain how it relates to lawyers working in areas of corporate governance and the risk management, corporate reporting and due diligence disclosure obligations, disputes, potential challenges, real estate, asset-based transactions, commercial contracts and agreements, and human rights and social governance issues. So it also provides specific guidance for domestic real estate and poses a risk of questions. The only practical way to answer these questions is to use climate data, the analysis and the searches to understand the impact of climate risk at the specific individual site. So as Stephen Truman Casey has commented, in the absence of search reports capable of objectively identify and ranking specific individual properties in terms of such risk, conveyancers could do little but one in general terms, which would be of a limited assistance to a client. So the guidance also make reference to the use of clauses such as those published by the Chancery Lane Project, or for specific clauses related to real estate, those the Ground have produced. So the following slides will now go through how to put this guidance into practice and ensure solicitors are able to adequately advise their clients using the tools available to them. So let's look at how to discharge your duty, right? So here I'm going to introduce you to Groundshaw Climate Index. So to aid in answering some of the questions on the previous page and to ensure compliance with any legal duties, we have developed Climate Index in June 2022. And on the right-hand side of the front page, we can see obviously Climate Index, which is the new module included in our core environmental searches. And as you can see, it analyzes 3 key physical risks, so flooding, ground instability, and coastal erosion, over 2 time horizons, 5 and 30 years. Both the physical risks and time horizons are based on what the Bank of England has been using in their stress test scenario. So Climate Index takes these physical risks and provides a property-specific rating from A to F, depending on the severity of the risk over the time. Now, this data is provided by Ambiental, BGS, and Environment Agency, using various RPCs, so emission scenarios, and all based on the UKCP 18, UK climate projections, which is the most authoritative climate projection data available, which has been developed by the Met Office. Further inside the report, you will find the full explanation of each risk category and what that means. So if there is a risk to the property, we will be able to see a breakdown of which peril is triggering the risk. So you commission a report, you identify the level of the risk to the property, and then you summarize it to the client. And we have a lot of information available to help make the discharging of duty to your client really straightforward. So we have client care letters. In addition to the covering letter, we have climate microsite, where you can download climate clauses for residential and commercial transactions. We have got FAQ sheets, and you, of course, have got the support of Groundshaw team to help you answer any questions you, of course, or your client that may have, and you can get your client to speak with us directly. If that is your preference, there is a phone number on each of the reports that they can obviously phone up and speak directly to our customer service team. So if we look then further on, the report comes with complete guidance if the risk is identified. And if the property is at the risk of flood and ground stability or coastal erosion, then hopefully, of course it isn't, but the client should follow the recommendations already present in the report. And we have the same going for the commercial one as well. So having commissioned the report, identifying the risk and implications over time, you'll know whether there is a concern to the client or not based on what it falls onto the scale. So these clauses have been prepared by Stephen Sykes and other lawyers, and over time these clauses may vary, change, and obviously be improved, but it's a good starting point. So in some cases, it may impact insurability or value, and the clauses do signpost at what point it makes sense to recommend to the client to approach a valuer or a specialist surveyor to try and quantify what this looming risk will do to the value of the asset, and that is in the climate clauses. So there are also questions to put to property brokers to check whether, if given a particular trajectory, it is looking unlikely or likely a property will be insurable or uninsurable in the future. So there is step where third parties get involved. Of course, I'm sure you'll be pleased all to hear about this because there is only so much that you can do. And there are roles for other professionals to be taken up on. So the banks and the insurers have already taken this on board and have their roles to play as well. So the solicitors and other industry professionals will again need to adapt. So here's just the summary of the report. So this is a residential report, but commercial one has, again, the same module, just in slightly different places. So the front page is the summary. Then there is a more detailed breakdown of information inside. Then there is guidance. And then there is a methodology and the data in the back of the report. So in summary, what you can do now is obtain a climate search for every transaction. You can use the clauses available to you and understand the risk and how they apply to your area of the law. And again, undertake training and professional development. So compliance officers for legal practices and managing partners will need to understand the implications of incorrect or misleading climate change reporting and advice, particularly in relation to corporate and real estate due diligence. Real estate lawyers and their marketing and communication team have a very important role to play in ensuring that they do not expose their firm to accusations of greenwashing. With ESG risk exposure rising, an overstatement of the firm's green sustainability credentials could easily have a negative effect on professional indemnity insurance renewals, a firm's operational policy and client retention and recruitment, and obviously things like that. Given the already elevated PI risks for conveyancing relative to other legal work, it is inevitable that law firms provide property and transaction advice. Again, we'll need to upskill to include climate risk advice. It is very important. So, for those of you not familiar with GroundSure, we are the largest environmental supplier in the conveyancing market. We provide accurate location intelligence and interpretation of risk alongside guidance. So we give land and property professionals expert information on a variety of environmental and ground risks, so they can advise their clients appropriately over a large range of different residential and commercial property transactions. So we pride ourselves actually in the quality of our data and information. And for those relying on our reports, we provide free access to our environmental consultants who can help with queries and questions on climate change, but also on contaminated land and flooding and ground stability, coastal erosion, mining, radon planning, energy, transportation, you name it. Everything that you report on. And around 70% of our time, our consultants take queries and questions directly from purchasers, actually. We even have a dedicated email address for our on-hand climate experts, as you can see on the slide. So we work with industry experts and professional associations, and we have climate-specific contact via microsite, including clauses, FAQ, blogs, and training materials. So if you require training, please, maybe for one of your solicitors or for your whole firm, then on implementing the guidance, then please reach out to legal brokers or myself, and we'll be able to set this up for you. And that's it. So I hope it was useful. If you do have any questions, then please do forward your feedback and questions across to legal brokers, and then they will pass it across to myself, who will be able to answer them. Thank you very much, and have a good day.